My name is Lillian Roberts. I'm 36 years old. And this is the story of how I sacrificed everything to save my family's legacy, only to be betrayed so deeply it nearly broke me. But in the end, I didn't just survive. I built something better and made sure they watched it rise. It began on a cool March afternoon in San Francisco, in the glass-walled office I built with nothing but sheer will and an old laptop. I remember the exact moment my phone buzzed on the desk. I was halfway through an earnings breakdown for a major fintech client. The numbers were sharp, aggressive. My kind of work. Then I saw the caller ID. Mom. I hesitated. She rarely called without texting first. Her voice was shaky, brittle. Lillian, your dad had a blood pressure spike. The doctor said it's stress-related. We got a foreclosure notice from the bank. Everything in me went cold. The Vineyard. Windrest. 3 generations of sweat and tradition. The land where I once ran between the rows of grapes with dusty knees and sunburnt shoulders. My grandfather's soil, my father's pride. My mother's tears were pouring down the phone line. We don't know what to do, she sobbed. Vanessa's still interning. You're our only hope. I didn't ask questions. Didn't lecture them about savings or debt or the cost of trust. I just opened my investment account and wired $720,000 to Windrest Estate LLC. All of it. My entire personal savings. 10 years of work. 10 years of 18-hour days and living off coffee and hustle while Vanessa, their golden child, took luxury vacations and artsy Instagram shots in Tuscany. I told myself it wasn't about them. It was about preserving the vineyard. About honoring the soil my grandfather taught me to respect. When I drove up that weekend, the vines were just starting to sprout, young and green and full of promise. My father hugged me tight. My mother cried again, this time with gratitude. Vanessa acted overwhelmed, thanking me again and again. They promised I'd be a central figure in the vineyard's future, that we would rebuild together. I believed them. God help me, I believed them. I poured my knowledge into Windrest like fertilizer, drawing up distribution plans, advising on vendor restructuring, negotiating potential placements in expos. I stayed late in the barn-turned office, detailing how to scale without selling out. Vanessa flitted around in maxi dresses and wide-brimmed hats, posting #BackToMyRoots captions on Instagram. I brushed it off. She was always theatrical. That didn't mean she wasn't grateful. But then came the harvest celebration. It was held in the same courtyard where Vanessa and I once played tag as kids. String lights hung overhead. Oak barrels turned into wine stands. Guests chattered over glasses of Pinot Noir. I stood beside my mother, feeling, for the first time in years, like maybe I belonged again. Then my father tapped the microphone and everything changed. Thank you all for coming to Windrest Estate's harvest celebration. This year is special, not just because of the incredible crop, but because we're entering a new era. We're proud to announce that the new CEO of Windrest Estate is Vanessa Roberts. Applause erupted. Glasses clinked. Cameras flashed. I didn't move. Couldn't breathe. Vanessa glided forward in ivory silk like a princess at coronation. She beamed as she took the mic, with the knowledge I gained during my MBA at Yale. I'm honored to take Windrest into a new chapter. Her voice faded into background noise. My ears rang. I stood frozen, wine glass suspended mid-air, my heart crashing against my ribs. The words that echoed in my head weren't hers. They were my father's from 6 months ago. Don't worry, sweetheart. We'll never forget what you've done. But they had. No mention of the money. No acknowledgement. No recognition. Just silence. I stepped away from the crowd, every breath sharp in the cold night air. I stared out at the vineyard rows, silent, indifferent, and bathed in moonlight. It hit me like a brick to the chest. I had saved them, and they had erased me. The next morning, I walked into Charlotte Mayer's office in Santa Rosa, a corporate attorney with a reputation for being cold and surgical. I wasn't looking for comfort. I was looking for a weapon. I slid a folder across the table. Bank statements, texts from my parents, the wire receipt. I want to know what my rights are, I said. Because this was a betrayal, and I won't let it stand. Charlotte flipped through the documents. Her brow arched. You wired this much with no written agreement. I trusted them, I said bitterly. She leaned back, tapping her pen on the desk. If there was a verbal promise made in front of a third party, we may have leverage. There was, I replied. Troy, the Vineyard's longtime accountant. He heard my father promise me a role. He even flinched when it was said, like he knew they'd forget. Charlotte nodded. Then we begin there. But I need you to understand, once we start, there's no going back. I didn't flinch. They've already burned that bridge, I said. I'm not here to cry about it. I'm here to light a match. Charlotte smiled for the first time. A small, sharp thing. Then let's make sure they remember who struck the flame. Charlotte moved fast. Within 24 hours, she drafted a formal demand letter to Windrest Estate LLC. In crisp, precise language, she outlined the full amount owed. $720,000 plus 6% annual interest, and gave them 30 days to respond before legal action would be pursued. It wasn't a threat. It was a promise wrapped in professionalism. I didn't even blink. I signed it with a pen that shook slightly in my hand, but not from fear, from adrenaline. 3 days later, the letter landed at Windrest's lawyer's office. The fallout was immediate. Vanessa called me first, her voice sharp, furious, almost panicked. What the hell are you doing, Lillian? You're going to destroy the family. Are you insane? Kept my voice level. No, Vanessa. What's insane is pretending like I didn't pour my life savings into that vineyard while you played CO Barbie on Instagram. You're just bitter, she snapped. Dad's in the hospital again. He can't take this stress. You're going to kill him. I closed my eyes, jaw clenched. You mean the same dad who promised he'd never forget what I did? The one who gave you my seat at the table? No, Vanessa. I'm not the problem here. I'm the consequence. She hung up in a storm of breathless rage. I didn't care. I wasn't doing this for attention or revenge. I was doing it for justice. Later that night I met Troy, the Vineyard's accountant, at a quiet cafe just outside Santa Rosa. He came in with tired eyes and a thick envelope tucked under his arm. He slid it across the table. This is the 6-month expenditure report for Windrest. You'll want to see this. I flipped through the pages. It wasn't just bad, it was criminal. $61,000 marked as ingredient transport for a Mercedes-Benz SUV. Multiple business-class flights to Europe. Market research. A $94,000 tuition payment listed under internal HR development. Vanessa's MBA. Could barely breathe. My eyes stung, not with tears, but with a fury so sharp it felt like glass in my throat. You knew about this, I whispered. Troy nodded, his expression ashamed. I kept quiet out of loyalty. But I can't anymore. Not after what they did to you. I've written a formal statement. I'll testify under oath. I looked him in the eye, and for the first time in weeks, I felt something close to hope. Thank you, Troy. You have no idea what this means. But it wasn't over. Not even close. 3 days later, Charlotte emailed me with a subject line that made my stomach drop. This is more serious than we thought. Inside was a document detailing the existence of a new LLC, Windrest Future Holdings, registered a week after my funds were wired. My father was listed as the legal representative. Vanessa was the second authorized party. My hands trembled. They weren't just spending my money. They were moving Windrest's assets, its land, equipment, branding, into a shell company behind my back. Charlotte's voice was grim when I called. They're prepping to bleed the original company dry and file bankruptcy. If they succeed, you won't even have legal standing to sue. I felt the blood drain from my face. They're going to kill Windrest just to save themselves. She was silent for a moment. Then, it's time to strike. That night I met Troy again. This time in a dark little bar in Healdsburg, the kind of place my parents would never step into. He brought his laptop and a USB drive. On the screen, he pulled up the Vineyard's asset transfer logs. Lots 4, 6, and 8, Windrest's most valuable parcels, the very heart of the estate, had been strategically restructured into Windrest future holdings. "This is theft," I whispered. "They're dismantling the house my grandfather built." "There's more," Troy said, sliding another folder toward me. "I found a draft merger contract. They're planning to absorb Windrest into holdings and wipe the original company clean. Your money goes with it. Erased." For a moment I felt paralyzed. Then something inside me clicked, like a switch. Not if I burn their plan to the ground first. Charlotte moved fast again. We sent a second demand letter. This one warning of pending complaints to the SEC and federal authorities for fraud, asset concealment, and breach of fiduciary duty. The language was legal steel. The message was simple: repay everything or face financial and criminal exposure. Within 24 hours, the banks started pulling away from Windrest. 3 emergency loan applications were denied. I watched, almost in disbelief, as my parents' empire began to crumble from the inside. Vanessa called again, her voice high and breathless. "You're going to ruin us." "Dead sick. Mom's a wreck. What do you want from us?" "I already told you," I said calmly. "I want what's mine. Nothing more. Nothing less." That night, Troy texted me. "They're trying to secure a private investor. Desperate. Let them panic." I wasn't done. The very next morning, while drinking coffee on my balcony, I opened an alert from a real estate app I'd forgotten I subscribed to. My breath caught in my throat. Stone Creek Vineyard, Windrest's longtime rival, was up for sale. 190 pristine acres. South-facing slopes. Directly across the valley. From the top of Stone Creek's ridge, you could see every inch of Windrest. The thought hit me like lightning. What if I didn't just get justice? What if I took everything they thought I'd never deserve? I picked up my phone and texted Charlotte. "Stone Creek is for sale. I want to move." Her reply came in seconds. "Are you sure? This will hit them where it hurts most." I stared out over the city, heart pounding, and smiled. Exactly. By noon that same day, I was standing on the sun-drenched hills of Stone Creek Vineyard. The air smelled of dust, ripe grapes, and potential. Rows of vines stretched before me, the soil dark and healthy underfoot. I could see Windrest in the distance, barely a silhouette across the valley. From here it looked small, vulnerable. Ryan Calloway, the real estate agent, was already waiting near the barn office. He wore jeans, boots, and a crisp button-up shirt. A seasoned man in his 50s with salt and pepper hair and eyes that had clearly seen hundreds of deals. But the way he looked at me, calculated, intrigued, I could tell he knew who I was. "I've heard about you," he said as we shook hands. "Robert's oldest daughter. The one who didn't go into the family business. Until now." I didn't flinch. "I'm not here to follow their legacy," I said. "I'm here to build my own." Ryan gave a slow nod. "Stone Creek's got solid bones. The current owners are retiring. No liens, no lawsuits, just land and possibility." We walked the property together as I explained my vision. Premium blends, immersive tours, a vineyard that would outshine Windrest not just in quality, but in soul. I told him I wanted to revive everything Windrest had once promised but failed to protect. "You've got the fire," he said, handing me the preliminary agreement. "Let's make it real." I signed a memorandum of understanding that very afternoon. 10% down to hold the sale if no legal barriers emerged in 20 days. I wasn't backing out. Not unless I was forced to. And by then I knew. Nothing could force me now. I drove straight to Charlotte's office and dropped the signed documents on her desk. She glanced at the papers, then back at me. "You're really doing this?" "I'm not just fighting back," I said. "I'm replacing them." That night, Charlotte sent Windrest's attorney our final notice. Attached to it was a high-resolution photo taken from the top of Stone Creek, looking down across the valley at Windrest. There were no threats, no insults, Just an image and one clear message. Your reign is over. Within 20 minutes, my phone wouldn't stop ringing. First Dad. Then Mom. Then Vanessa. I didn't answer. The next morning Troy texted me. Emergency meeting at Windrest. Your dad and Vanessa are at each other's throats. She's begging him to stop you from buying Stone Creek. I didn't even smile. Not because I wasn't satisfied, but because this wasn't about vengeance anymore. This was about justice and clarity. Later that day, while reviewing renovation blueprints at my Santa Rosa apartment, Charlotte called. Her voice was tight but bursting with energy. They signed, Lillian. I stood up, nearly dropping my laptop. Signed what? The loan. With Redwood Bank. Full principal repayment plus interest. Total. $761,200. I didn't speak for a few seconds. It didn't feel real. They mortgaged the house and liquidated some equipment. The bank only approved the loan after receiving the SEC notice. They knew we were serious. I exhaled slowly. My entire body vibrated with something unfamiliar. Peace, maybe. Or just closure. They chose reputation over honor, I said finally. They chose desperation, Charlotte replied. You didn't win because they caved. You won because you didn't. That afternoon the funds hit my account. I sat alone in my apartment, staring at the balance. My money. Every cent. No apology. No call. Just a cold message from my father. The money's been transferred. 3 words that said everything and nothing. But it didn't matter. Because now, I didn't need a place at their table. I had built my own. 3 days later, I returned to Stone Creek and signed the final contract. Ryan Calloway shook my hand with a kind of reverence I hadn't expected. You're the strongest woman I've ever met in this business, he said. They should have never underestimated you. Smiled. Let's show them why. That same day, I officially became the owner of all 190 acres of Stone Creek. I renamed it Solera Ridge, a name that meant light reborn. It wasn't about rubbing it in their faces. It was about honoring the part of me they'd tried to bury. A week after the transfer, Vanessa showed up at the gates. She looked nothing like the polished CEO she'd pretended to be. Her hair was tied in a messy bun. No makeup. Her eyes were swollen, dark with regret or maybe just exhaustion. I need to talk to you, she said, voice soft. I folded my arms. Talk then. I know I was wrong. It went too far. But this. You don't have to destroy everything. You got your money. You bought their rival. You won. I tilted my head. You still don't get it. This wasn't about winning. She stared at me, blinking. It was about truth. About dignity. You all acted like I didn't exist. You erased me. Now you want me to stop because it's inconvenient. I made mistakes, she whispered. No, I replied. You made choices. She was quiet for a long moment. Then said, almost to herself, Dad hasn't spoken to anyone since signing the papers. Good, I said. Let him think about what he lost. She turned and walked away, her shoulders sagging. I didn't feel vindictive. Felt free. Troy was waiting inside the newly refurbished barn that now served as Solera Ridge's temporary office. When I walked in, he handed me the first full layout draft for the new operations center. You ready for this? He asked. I looked around at the empty desks, the bare walls, the light pouring in through the skylight. I've been ready for years. The first thing I did as the new owner of Solera Ridge was offer Troy the CFO position. He blinked in surprise. You trust me that much? I trust that you know what betrayal looks like, and how to avoid repeating it, I said. You saw Windrest fall apart from the inside. I want this place to grow for the right reasons. He didn't hesitate. Then let's make this place everything they said you weren't capable of building. And just like that, Solera Ridge had its first pillar of leadership. Troy brought more than spreadsheets, he brought people. Real people. A viticulturist from Oregon. A branding expert who'd worked with 2 award-winning wineries. a no-nonsense operations manager from Sonoma who ran production like a war zone. We started from almost zero. The land was good, no, it was excellent. Rich soil, perfect sun exposure, and rows of Cabernet Franc, Merlot, and Chardonnay vines that had been underutilized for years. But the equipment was outdated. The irrigation system needed work. We had a lot to do, and no time to waste. But this time I wasn't alone. Every step, I walked the vineyard alongside the crew. Wore the same boots, got the same dirt under my nails. The laborers noticed. So did the consultants. I wasn't the absentee owner sipping from a glass tower. I was the woman in the field, sleeves rolled up, planning logistics while checking pH levels in the soil. And every time I looked across the valley and saw Windrest in the distance, its once glorious silhouette shrinking behind old traditions and broken promises, I didn't feel rage. Felt drive. We named our first product line Second Harvest, a symbol of resilience. It was for everything people thought had gone to waste. Dreams, dignity, family. But all of it had returned, stronger, more vibrant. Like grapes harvested in a late season, deeper and sweeter than expected. The bottle design was simple. A hand rising from the soil, holding a cluster of dark, ripe grapes. It wasn't about elegance. It was about truth. One morning, weeks into harvest prep, Charlotte stopped by. She brought a bottle of Chardonnay and a thin, leather folder. "To Solera Ridge," she said, holding up her glass. We clinked with plastic cups. I laughed. "You'd think after all this, I'd be drinking from crystal." "Crystal cracks easier," she said. I opened the folder. Inside were licensing approvals, distribution contracts, and most surprising, an email from a Los Angeles-based wine distributor. "They want 200 cases for the holidays," she said. I blinked. "We haven't even bottled the first batch yet." "Then we'd better start bottling," said Troy, who had just walked in. We called an emergency team meeting that afternoon. Everyone stared at me like I was insane when I said we'd meet the demand, and then exceed it. But no one argued, because by then they believed in what we were doing. They believed in me. That same day, Troy pulled me aside. "Windrest just cut their marketing budget," he said. "Banks tightening the leash. They're struggling." I said nothing. Just looked toward the hill where their vines withered in shadows while ours stretched for the light. Then, on a cool October morning, just as the first grapes were pressed and the scent of fermentation filled the air, a package arrived at my office. No return label. Just my name in a familiar script. I froze when I saw it. It was my grandfather's handwriting. I opened it slowly, fingers trembling, and pulled out a worn leather-bound notebook. The Vineyard journal. His journal. The one I hadn't seen in over 20 years. Pages yellowed with age. Notes on blending techniques. Soil analysis. Wind patterns over the western ridge. And tucked in the back, a folded page. Opened it. My father's handwriting. Slightly shaky. A single paragraph. "Dear Lillian, I've been rereading this journal. In every line I see you. The precision, the patience, the strength. Maybe I clung too tightly to what I thought was right and forgot that some people need to break the mold to grow. I'm not good with apologies. But this was your grandfather's treasure. And now, it belongs to the one who truly understands it. Dad." I stood there for a long time, holding the page against my heart. No grand gesture. No redemption arc. Just this. It wasn't enough to erase the betrayal. But it was enough to know that, in his own way, he had seen me. Maybe too late. But still. In the spring, our first batch of Second Harvest debuted at the North Bay Wine Expo. Critics called it surprisingly profound, elegant yet grounded, and a story in a bottle. They didn't know just how right they were. Troy leaned in and whispered, "Vanessa's no longer CEO. Bank forced a neutral director. She moved to the city. Signed up for an art course." I didn't smile. But I did breathe easier. Sometimes failure is the only way some people learn who they really are. I never heard from my mother again. After she tried to hand me her wedding ring and the deed to the house, she disappeared behind silence. But I no longer needed her words. I wasn't looking for reconciliation. I had built a future, not a repair job. Solera Ridge sold out its entire first run. We launched a second line, Legacy Bloom, named by Troy, inspired by the idea that some things must break before they can blossom. That summer, as lavender bloomed along the fence and the barrels aged beneath our barn roof, I stood by the vineyard edge with a glass of our own Cabernet Franc, the same grape my grandfather first taught me to prune. The wind brushed my cheek, closed my eyes, and heard his voice in memory. If you care for it the right way, a vine will never betray you. I kept that vineyard journal on my desk, always open to a different page each day. Like scripture, like a compass. Sometimes I'd flip to a map of the hillside, where my grandfather had marked wind paths with tiny arrows. Other days I reread his notes on tannin balance or fruit layering. But the part one returned to most often was scribbled in the corner of one of the earliest pages. Don't let a vine grow wild. Needs a frame, direction, purpose. Only then will it bear true fruit. I read it like he'd written it for me. Not for grapes, but for the daughter who'd been denied her frame, her direction, until she built it herself. Within 6 months, Solera Ridge was gaining traction in ways I hadn't dared to imagine. Napa locals whispered our name with cautious curiosity. Sommeliers from mid-tier restaurants started calling. Our email list exploded after the wine expo. We weren't a threat to the old houses yet, but we were something more dangerous. We were a disruption, and people noticed. One afternoon, just before bottling our second run of Legacy Bloom, a woman in her 60s came to visit. She wore a faded straw hat and carried a small canvas bag. She introduced herself as Nora, a former vineyard owner from Oregon who had read our story in a trade magazine. I lost everything when I refused to co-sign my son's second mortgage, she said plainly, sitting across from me in our bare-bones tasting room. He forged my signature anyway. Took me 2 years to prove it. By then he'd sold the land. And my voice. My throat tightened. I knew that feeling. The silencing. She reached into her canvas bag and pulled out a bottle of her old label. Dusty, unopened for years. I brought this to remember what was mine, she said. And to give you this, because you reminded me that no one, not even family, gets to decide your worth. I didn't know what to say. So I just placed my hand over hers and whispered, you still have a path ahead of you. Just like I did. After she left, I sat under the same hill where our lavender bloomed and stared at the bottle for a long time. It was more than wine. It was proof that people like us, people betrayed by their own blood, could still stand tall. That evening, I drafted a plan for an annual event I would call Reclaiming Roots. A gathering at Solera Ridge for anyone, especially women, who had been pushed out of family businesses, silenced in partnerships, or stripped of their legacy. We'd offer free legal consultations, financial planning sessions, and small batch mentorships with industry professionals. It would be our way of giving people the tools I never had, until I was forced to find them on my own. Troy backed the idea fully. This isn't just a winery anymore, he said. It's a statement. And it was. The first event drew nearly 70 attendees. Women from California, Arizona, even a few from New York. The stories poured in: heartbreak, betrayal, legal manipulation, quiet erasure. But so did something else. Oh. Solera Ridge was becoming more than a vineyard. It was becoming a place of restoration. Meanwhile, Windrest continued to struggle. Rumors floated that the neutral director brought in by the bank was gutting operations to save costs. The visitor center was closed. Marketing campaigns were suspended. They pulled out of the next regional wine expo. And still, I didn't feel joy in their collapse. Only clarity. Because what they failed to protect, I had resurrected from the ashes. Not for revenge, but for something better. Every once in a while, a bottle from Windrest would appear in a small wine shop or a clearance rack. The labels still bore the name that once stood for generations. But inside, the wine lacked something. Oh. Back at Solera, we were bottling our first run of a new line. Inheritance deferred. It was made from the earliest plots I'd invested in reclaiming. Harvested at the edge of the season, matured longer in French oak barrels, and infused with layers of red fruit, clove, and history. I wrote the label description myself. Crafted by hands once cast aside, this wine honors what was nearly lost and celebrates what rises again when truth is tended with care. By now, Charlotte had become more than my lawyer. She was a friend, sister in battle. She visited often, always with news from the outside world. Regulatory updates, new trends in boutique wine law, even a potential offer from a hospitality group wanting to feature us in a sustainable tourism campaign. "You're building a brand with soul," she said one night over dinner in the barn office. "That's rare. And terrifying to those who build only on appearance." I looked out the window. The moonlight was soft over the vines. Let them be terrified. I didn't come this far to make them comfortable. One morning, just before the fall season began, I got a letter. Handwritten. No stamp. No envelope. Just slipped under the door. It was from my father. "Lillian, I saw your name in a wine review last week. They said your wine had layers of sorrow and strength." I couldn't help but agree. "I don't expect forgiveness. I just wanted you to know Windrest is for sale. We can't keep it. I don't know if it means anything anymore. But I'm sorry. Not just for the money. For forgetting who you are." I read it once. Then again. And I folded it slowly, placing it inside my grandfather's journal. It didn't undo the betrayal. But it proved one thing. Even the ones who try to erase you can't deny your truth forever. The letter from my father sat tucked inside my grandfather's journal for days before I allowed myself to look at it again. Not because I doubted its words, but because I had to protect the part of myself that had finally stopped bleeding. Windrest was for sale. I wasn't surprised. I'd heard whispers through distributors, through staff who had quietly left, through a friend in the local agriculture board who said the bank had grown tired of holding the leash. The estate was a shell. The land still held potential, but its heart was hollowed out. Vanessa was gone, likely off reinventing herself again, this time far away from the shadows of Napa. My mother hadn't reached out since handing me the folder of their pledged assets. It was as if she'd evaporated. But I remained. And Solera Ridge thrived. That fall, we hit another milestone. A distribution deal with a national boutique wine network that would bring our legacy Bloom line into select restaurants from San Francisco to Chicago. The demand outpaced our projections, and for the first time we had to waitlist buyers. The success was intoxicating, but I kept my boots planted in the soil. Literally. I still walked the rows every morning before staff arrived, journal in hand, checking the leaves, touching the bark, whispering things I remembered my grandfather saying, "A good vine listens more than it speaks." But I wasn't just tending vines anymore. I was tending people. The second Reclaiming Roots event brought over 120 attendees. People with stories that mirrored my own. One woman had been cut out of her family's almond farm after years of labor. Another had been pushed out of a tech startup she helped build from a college dorm room. They came with pain. And they left with power. I watched them walk the same rows I did, hold the same journals we offered at every event, blank inside, waiting to be written. Watching them was like seeing the fragments of my old self gather and harden into something whole. Charlotte smiled at me from under the barn archway during the second day of the event. "You've started something you'll never be able to measure," she said. "That's the point," I replied. But there was one thing left I hadn't faced. Windrest. Not the business. The land. The place where it all began. One chilly morning, just after dawn, I took the old dirt road around the far ridge where you could overlook both vineyards from above. I parked at a forgotten turnout, hiked the last few yards and stood at the peak. Below me, Solera Ridge, thriving with rows of green and gold. To the right, Windrest, faded and uneven, the vines clinging to structure but without direction. Like abandoned soldiers waiting for orders that would never come. And then I saw him, my father, sitting on an overturned barrel, staring out at the fields. His shoulders slightly hunched, a cane resting beside him. He didn't move when I came closer. Didn't turn his head. But I knew he heard me. "I got your letter," I said. Still silence. I sat down on a rock a few feet away, not facing him, just looking at the land. "It's strange, isn't it?" Continued. "How everything we think will last forever doesn't." "I thought you hated me," he said quietly. "I did. Maybe I still do sometimes." He nodded. "I didn't come here for reconciliation," I said. "I came here to tell you something." He waited. "I didn't build Solera Ridge because I wanted revenge. I built it because I had to remember who I was. You made me forget. All of you did." He finally turned his head, slowly, painfully. "And now I don't need anyone to remember me. Because I never forgot myself again." He stared at me for a long time, then looked back at the field. "I see you in the land," he said. "Even now. Especially now." I didn't cry. I didn't reach for him. I didn't need to. That was his burden to carry, not mine. That afternoon, I returned to Solera Ridge with something solid in my chest. Not pride. Not vindication. Just peace. Troy met me in the office, holding a tablet. "Windrest has an interested buyer," he said. "Big Vineyard group from Sonoma. You want me to check the terms?" I shook my head. "Let it go," I said. "Let it all go." He looked surprised. But then he smiled. "You don't need to own their ashes to prove you've risen." Exactly. That night, while cleaning my office, I found a sheet of paper I'd scribbled on during a wine tasting months ago. It had a quote I'd jotted down from a critic describing our first release. "Unexpectedly grounded. A wine that speaks with its hands, not its ego." I smiled at that. Because that's what I had become. Grounded. Not flashy. Not loud. Just rooted. And real. And for the first time I understood something vital. The family I needed wasn't the one I was born into. It was the one I built. 1 year to the day after the money landed back in my account, I stood on the balcony of Solera Ridge's new guest house, a structure we built from the ground up, using reclaimed wood from a demolished barn on the far edge of the property. It overlooked everything: the rows of Cabernet Franc vines, the lavender beds we'd planted along the southern fence, and the ridge where I first stood with Ryan Calloway and said, "Let's make it real." The wind was soft that morning, carrying scents of citrus and crushed earth. The kind of air that makes you close your eyes without realizing it. Troy joined me with 2 glasses of our newest release, Inheritance Deferred. "You know," he said, "we just passed 5,000 pre-orders for Legacy Bloom. We're on track to triple our first-year projections." I nodded, sipping the wine that had once existed only as an idea in my notebook. "I don't measure this by cases or cash flow," I said. "I measure it by mornings like this." He smiled. "Then you're richer than you think." As the sun climbed higher, the vineyard staff began arriving, most of them still in work boots and coffee in hand. I waved at them. They waved back. Not one of them cared that I used to be the Roberts' forgotten daughter. I wasn't Lillian of Windrest anymore. I was Lillian of Solera Ridge. Later that day, Charlotte stopped by with an envelope from the Department of Agriculture. Inside was a certification approval for our sustainable farming initiative. Solera Ridge had just become one of only 4 female-led vineyards in Northern California to receive it. "You've built more than a business," she said, hugging me for the first time. "You've built a legacy out of loss." I didn't say anything. Just held the paper close, like a final piece of armor finally clicking into place. But the moment that stayed with me forever came later that evening. A young woman, barely in her 20s, showed up at the vineyard. She had nervous eyes and calloused fingers. Said she'd read about Solera Ridge in an article titled, "Where Daughters Don't Disappear." "I want to work here," she said. "I don't care if I'm sweeping floors. I just want to be somewhere women get to be seen." I hired her on the spot. And as she walked beside me through the vineyard, asking a dozen questions about trellising and pruning, I felt something lift in my chest. It wasn't victory. It was continuity. The next morning, I returned to the West Ridge and opened my grandfather's journal. There was only one blank page left. I pulled out a pen, closed my eyes and wrote, "A legacy begins again in the place once rejected." As I set the book down on the vineyard bench, I knew the truth of it. I hadn't just reclaimed what was stolen. I'd rewritten what legacy meant. Not money. Not property. Not even blood. Legacy was what we leave behind in the hearts we help grow. As the seasons turned and the vineyard matured, so did I. I stopped hoping my mother would call. I stopped checking Windrest's name in industry reports. They were background noise now. A chapter closed. I still kept my father's note in the journal. It reminded me not of pain, but of distance, how far I'd come, how far I'd had to go to find myself. Months later, I stood on a panel at a winemaker's summit beside women I'd once idolized, now my peers. One asked how I managed to turn betrayal into beauty. I smiled and said, "I didn't choose revenge. Chose justice. I didn't destroy. I rebuilt. The ones who underestimated me gave me something precious. Freedom. And from that freedom, I created fruit." The applause that followed didn't matter as much as the look in the eyes of the women in the front row. Wide, fierce, hungry for their own redemption. After the panel, I returned to the vineyard and walked the rows alone. The vines had grown thicker, stronger, climbing up the wire frames we'd built with our bare hands. And in that quiet, with the sun dipping behind the trees, I heard my grandfather's voice once more. "If you guide it toward the light, it will never betray you. Neither will you, Grandpa. Not anymore." Lillian's story isn't just about money, wine, or business. It's about reclaiming what others tried to take, not through anger, but with purpose. When blood betrayed her, she didn't break. She built. From her pain, she cultivated justice. From betrayal, she made something that would outlast memory. Because in the end, it's not about proving them wrong. It's about proving yourself right. If this story moved you, share your thoughts below. What would you have done in Lillian's place? Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to Revenge Echoes, where stories speak louder than revenge.